I'm going to want to share. I'm going to want to share desktop 2. And so I'm going to hit share. I am using a new MacBook, so you guys get to laugh at me because right now I have to like set things up to say that you have the right to do that. Location services.
A lot of us are not Mac users, so don't worry about it.
All right. So what am I trying to do? I'm trying to share my screen. Sharing my screen. What else do I have to do here? Okay, that's okay. So let's hit share screen. Desktop 2. Share. Oh, Zoom. Security and privacy. Oh, now I get it. I have to actually allow Zoom to do it. Oh boy.
Yeah,
This is obviously the first thing I have done with this. So Apple advertising and
has these layers of security,
which is generally very cool. And
yeah, it is. Even at the application level, it does that.
Okay, privacy general.
Yeah, and that's always the worst about getting a new, device. Is just trying to set up all the settings and privacy and checking all the boxes.
Exactly. And if I was, at all on top of my game, I would have made sure I did this before getting started. Let's see if it'll let me do desktop 1. Open system preferences, security and privacy. Ah, there we go. Works better if you put in the administrator thing. Zoom. Oh, wow. Cancel. Okay. Okay. Later. Not be able to record the content. Oh, okay. I have to quit and reopen Zoom. 1 second. I'll be right back.
Thanks again, Saad, for letting us use your room too. We really appreciate it.
That's fine. My pleasure. It's fine. Thank you. Thank you for making the effort to send the word out. I hope more people can join.
Yeah, I know. I saw there were some reminders that went out on the Discord and stuff. So hopefully we'll see.
Yep.
Also, I don't know if you've seen the bulletins that I've been making every month for the student government, but I've been trying to put a pun in each one, so in honor of you. So I'll have to send them to
you. Wow. Yeah, I know many years ago in the internet programming class, one of the student actually created the website I collected all my puns all semester long, and then they called these puns Saadism.
Oh my gosh.
That's awesome. All right. So now that I finally figured out what I'm doing, I'm now sharing my screen. And I'm going to go ahead and jump on in since I burned a little bit of time trying to figure out my computer. So it's a pleasure to meet you. I am, as mentioned, now I'm kind of a boss project manager person. Actually, I Service Express, just bought iTech. So my job description is a little bit different and stuff like that. But the important thing is how to get in touch with me. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything. And careers are long, and you have to find ways to keep yourself engaged and having a good time. So one of the things that I love to do is read. My mom is a librarian. I have always loved books, and I absolutely am fascinated with NASA, the moonshot, all of this great kind of stuff. So whenever I'm doing any of my talks, particularly on professional development, I always like to go back to books. And as students, I'm going to tell you guys, there's so much information in information technology, and there are so many things that are going to change and evolve over the course of your career. You're never going to be able to memorize everything. So get very used to being reliant upon looking up the information you need at the time, whether that's Google and YouTube, whether it's, different user groups and community groups that can help you, or my personal favorite, which is books. So most of my sessions start with books. These are 3 of my current favorites. I think at last count I have something like 100 different books on NASA. I have a problem. Yeah, it's kind of a dependency on books, but these are the fun ones that I'm looking at right now. So American Moonshot is very cool because it talks about the politics that were behind why we did what we did. By the time that it was decided to go to the moon, right? We're going to go to the moon. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It was costing the American people 50 cents per day for every man, woman, and child in America. That's a lot of money. So why did we do this? How on earth did we get that check signed? American Moonshot talks about that. Apollo to the moon, and this is actually a great one to be mentioning now right before the holidays. If you have anyone on your list who likes coffee table books, or maybe somebody older in your family who was a space buff back in the 60s and 70s, this is a beautifully glossy book, very eye-catching. And each page is a photograph, and it talks about an object that was involved or brought back from the moon. Really cool presents if you need an idea for somebody like my age or a little bit older. And across the airless wilds, if you are geeks, and given the fact that you are all in IT, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess you are. This talks about the actual rover machine. Looked a lot like a golf cart that was used on the moon. Absolutely fascinating if you like books. So let's jump right on in. If you want more reading material, hit me up and I will be able to help you with a lot. So I am a long time IBMI power systems aficionado. But let's be honest, it doesn't have like the sexiest reputation. It doesn't have like, oh, that is so cool. You program an RPG. Has never been said by anybody ever. Let's be honest. So let's talk about some of the stuff that was going on in the early days of the American Moonshot. Actually, in the early 60s and late 50s, America was kind of like the IBMI of the space world. We were getting smoked by the Russians. They did everything faster than we did. They did everything flashier than we did. They were just doing great. Out of the gate, they were doing it. So the important thing that started this whole thing off, though, why did we even start thinking it was a good idea to go into the atmosphere, right? Sputnik. So in the 1950s, after World War II, when things had started to get very tense between the United States and Russia, and communism was an issue, the Russians launched Sputnik. And that meant, every hour there was this round thing circling the planet going beep, beep, beep. That didn't do much. It was in an orbit and it was relaying radio transmissions. It really wasn't doing anything else. But of course, we're human beings and we super love to think about weapons. That's what human beings seem to do best. And so it didn't take a whole lot of imagination to say, okay, if they can put something to orbit the globe to go beep, 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 they can also drop something on our heads at any given time. So obviously, because instead of trying to make sure somebody didn't want to drop something on our heads, we decided as Americans, let's make sure we can put something up that can drop things on people's heads. American, or I should say human nature at its finest. So first man in space was Yuri Gagarin versus Alan Shepard. And there was a good 18 months difference there. John Grissom and John Glenn. But we don't know that much about anyone other than Yuri Gagarin. So we can tell you a huge amount of money or a huge amount of information about the Mercury 7, right? They were 7 people who were splashed all over the place. There were 7 hyper competent men, of course. But we really don't know that much, and no one knew very much at that time about any of the Russian cosmonauts. So, couldn't really tell you the second thing about Yuri Gagarin if it was back in the 60s, whereas, Alan Shepard, we knew everything about the guy down to his shoe size, right? So the first spacewalk was Alexei Leonov in 1965. First woman in space, which I, of course, think is tremendously awesome. First woman in space was Valentina, I'm going to get the name wrong, in 1963. The Americans did not launch a woman until the 80s. That is super cool. And she actually was a very cool woman. Again, now that things have been declassified, you can read more about her. But this is when we start to do well. We did the first rendezvous and docking, and we did definitely do the first moon landing, although this first successful lunar orbit was Luna 10, which was Russian. So kind of cool. So why exactly, how did we get from, hey, we don't even know what this circle thing is, to going to the moon? Well, so people started to get involved with going to the moon. Sputnik was launched, and in the early 60s, we started to catch up, okay? And John Glenn was able to do what was called a suborbital pop and spent 15 minutes in space. And Kennedy, who was very forward thinking, I mean, you know, I'm not going to get into politics here, but you got to admit the guy had the ability to go, this is something cool. And he had the ability to convince people to come along with him for the ride. And he went to a college and did a speech. And he is so excited about the fact that we had launched Glenn or Shepard. And so keep in mind that at this point in time, like the Russians had done orbiting, the Russians had had multiple flights, Russians had done this, that, and the next thing. We had 15 minutes. And Kennedy, like, you know, I always joke, you know, like all good managers says, we're going to do this thing without ever making sure. You've probably all seen the meme where there's sales talking to a customer and there's a dog underneath the table and somebody's got their hand on it. And it's like, this is sales telling the customer something can be done. And the dog is the engineers who are saying, no, it really can't be. So kind of the same thing in this case. But he was fired up, and he fired up an entire generation, an entire country. He said some really cool things that I go back to all the time in my personal life. I find these comments very inspirational. In some measure, it is an act of faith and vision. That is your career. That is your choices about work-life balance. That is your choices about going into IBMIs or IT or whatever you're going to do as a career. It's an act of faith and vision, because we don't know what benefit is going to await us, right? None of us have a crystal ball. We cannot guarantee we will be first, but we know that the failure to try will make us last. There's going to be a ton of times in your career that you have to say, am I going to go for this or not? And it's not always going to be the right decision to go for it. But if it is something that you want, you'll never be able to guarantee whether or not you're going to get the promotion or whether you're going to get the new job or whatever that might be. But if you don't even try, you're never going to get it. And it's better to fail for something you believe in than succeed at something you don't. At least that's my opinion. But I love this line. We choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, because they are hard. When I am asked, why power systems? Why IBMI? You know, not exactly the most popular IT specialty on the planet. I will tell people the same thing I am saying today. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. It is the best way of doing a lot of things in business. It is the strongest business computing platform out there. It has been proven, it will continue to be proven, and it is a rock solid career choice. Yeah, I know it's not as easy as other specialties. I get that. I agree. But it is, you know, again, to quote another Tom Hanks movie, it's the hard that makes it great. And I will agree with that, and I will advocate for that all the time. So now that we've talked about how we decided to start talking about this, let's talk about an early failure, because that's always a great start to a presentation. So most people know that Alan Shepard was our first astronaut in orbit, or pardon me, in space, first American. And we know that John Glenn was the first American to orbit. How many people know that there was somebody in between? And of course, this works a lot better when we're all in the same room. So I'm going to just pretend like somebody is agreeing with me. I've got cats. I'm used to talking to myself. All right. So there was a guy in between. His name was Gus Grissom. This was a great guy. He was obviously one of the Mercury 7. And he was an absolutely remarkable person and astronaut. He probably had one of the best hearts of everyone in the astronaut corps. So he was the second launch. He was the Liberty Bell. All of the Mercury missions were named 7. Okay, because it was in solidarity with each other. There were 6 of them total. And so he was Liberty Bell 7. And unfortunately, what happened, it was a picture perfect mission. He landed exactly where he was supposed to land, did all of the mission objectives, and he was waiting for the boat to come get him. They landed in the middle of the ocean. So he had to sit there. There were drogues and parachutes, and he's sitting there waiting to be picked up. And unfortunately, this was the second time we'd ever used this spacecraft, and a hatch blew. It had an explosive hatch, and unfortunately, the pyrotechnics that were used to make the hatch open exploded on their own from the salt water contaminating a sensor. So at this point in time, helicopter's almost there to pick them up. They see that the hatch blew. They see Gus going like this and waving his arms. And they think, okay, we're going to go after the really, really expensive multi-million-dollar capsule because we don't want that to sink into the ocean. Gus is fine. That's why he's waving at us. He can keep swimming. Okay, if you're looking at this picture and you see how much this guy is wearing, does that look like something you want to go swimming in? No, he almost drowned. Very, very, very dangerous. He almost drowned. They were not able to get the capsule at that point in time. They did, however, save Gus, which is a very, very good thing. But it's interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit about in quality assurance and in IT, we have a habit of overreacting and almost victim blaming. It's not exactly the word I want to use, but it is a concept. And unfortunately, the taint of this mission followed poor Gus around. And it did also end up leading to some interesting choices that he made and that NASA made. So very, very interesting. When the capsule sank, it was in 15,000 feet of water, 3,000 feet deeper than the Titanic. And it was actually able to be recovered. I believe it was around the year 2000. They were actually able to get it off the floor of the ocean. If you want to read about a more recent, absolutely technological marvel, how they got the capsule off the floor of the ocean and researched what happened and were able to study it is fascinating if you like sciencey, techie type stuff. And one of the really cool things that they proved, even after all this time, was that the hatch did blow. Kind of a neat thing that they were able to do. So here's some information. My slides always have my presentations always have slides for, hey, that was a cool thing she told me. Now I want to figure out how I can look it up. That's what these slides are. All right, so let's go into our next slide that we're actually going to talk about. So number 1 was Shepard. Number 2 was poor Gus. Number 3 was Glenn with a full actual orbit. And now we come up to Scott Carpenter. So during the first of Glenn's orbits, which were the first time we actually orbited the Earth, he noticed these small particles that were actually floating outside of his capsule. And he reported it back. No one knew exactly what it was. Now, Scott was somebody who never met a mystery he didn't want to solve. It was just his personality type. And he was bound and determined on the very next flight to figure out what these fireflies were. It really looked a lot like fireflies. So Scott was gonna figure this out. He was a man on a mission, no pun intended. Sorry, couldn't resist. So anyway, so he was like, all right, we're gonna figure this out. Fortunately, he got so tracked on that he completely blew the mission objectives. He did not accomplish a lot of things, and he used way too much maneuvering fuel in order to be able to solve a problem that was not a priority. So the problem was he didn't get done what he needed to get done. He didn't really get done what he wanted to get done. He wasted a whole bunch of resources that he needed. And in doing so, he ended up landing wildly off course. Hundreds of miles, which when you're talking about the ocean, you kind of want to be where they're expecting you. If you're a couple hundred miles away, it's going to get a lot harder for the ship and the helicopter to get to you. Luckily, he did not have the problems Gus had with the capsule. He just sat there and hung out for a few hours. They picked him up. Turned out, very interestingly, that what those fireflies were condensation that had formed on the capsule during the launch process. So went into space, it ended up making condensation that then froze, and then the stress of the launch and going into orbit broke off that condensation, that frozen condensation. And of course, in space, there is no gravity. So the capsule itself became its own gravitational force. So all of those particulates flew around the only gravity they could find. It also was probably, in addition to this frozen condensation, was vented waste. So I might have answered why it was yellow, and we're going to just move on. So on that first slide I showed you a bunch of examples where the Russians did it first. But as we're going to discuss, the Americans did it better. So in 1965, we start really making the progress towards what's called rendezvous and orbital mechanics. It is very hard to get two things on the same plane in space for an orbit. So how many people have seen, space movies where there's a ship over there and I'm gonna get over there and I'm gonna go really, really, really fast and I'm gonna go straight at it. That's not how it works, right? So in orbital mechanics, what happens is the faster you go, the higher you go. The slower you go, the lower you go. So it's not a matter of going straight at something. It's a matter of slowing or speeding up so that the two orbits match. You're going up and down, not back and forth. This is not an easy thing to do. So Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 were super awesome because what happened was we proved that America could have two launches simultaneously, although they were on different days. We could have two flights in space at the same time with two crews orbiting the planet. And again, this was before satellites, obviously. So all of this was going to relay stations. There was support around the world. And they were actually able to do that. And then very, very importantly, they were able to fly in a rendezvous position for at a distance of 9 feet for a couple of hours. Absolutely breathtaking science. So was it all those cool firsts? No, but when we really talk about the technology, the math, the science, the computing, brain computing power that goes into having a career in information technology, this is the math that trailblazed what we now make our money off of, right? Absolutely brilliant. So my next slide is going to talk to you about some stuff that you can look up if you've got more information on it. But do a quick Wikipedia search. It's really cool math if you like math. All right, so we figured out we can fly in tandem. We figured out how to speed up and slow down and get next to each other. Now the next thing to do is dock. And this story is very near to my QA heart because if I had a dime for every time I saw something identical to this in the real world, I wouldn't still be working. So on Gemini 8, we were ready to dock. Now we weren't going to dock two manned spacecraft. We were going to dock a probe and a manned spaceship. So remember, we're talking about the fact that as we go around the Earth, this is before, global communication devices. So there would be handoff between different relay stations all over the globe. If you have any interest in this, watch the movie October Sky. It's a great example of all the different places people had to go around the world in order to have radio transmissions from these missions. Super cool information. So Scott and a little guy named Neil Armstrong, you're going to hear about him again later. And Dave Scott, who also went up on a few more flights, but you might not know his name as well. They were going to dock. So they docked, everything was going very, very well, and they were handed off from one transmission station to the next. In that blackout, So loss of signal. They weren't talking to anyone here on Earth. They weren't talking to NASA. The spacecraft began to turn very, very rapidly over and over and over. It was very dangerous, very high G forces. They almost passed out. They tried absolutely everything they could to get control. And the problem was that they were, their astronauts are amazing and can do a ton of stress on their body, but they're not, infinitely resourced. So they were very close to backing out. Something like 10 Gs were being experienced. And then the other thing was also, there is something called the gimbal in spacecraft. And that is a magnetic ball that allows the navigation system of the spacecraft to talk to the balancing, to talk to the rest of the systems. If that gets into lock, it's controlled by magnets. If it locks because you get too wildly out of whack, those magnets will lock and you can't talk to anybody. The navigation system is then blind. Super, super dangerous. So what do we think has happened, right? Something just went wrong. What do we think has happened? Well, we docked with the Agena. It's got to be the Agena. It's got to be the probe, right? Because we were fine before we docked with it. So it's got to be the probe. So they went ahead and let go of the probe, disengaged, and the problem didn't stop. So now they're trying to figure out, how do we fix what broke the spacecraft? And of course, they're very focused on, well, we were fine up until we docked with the Agena. Well, what had actually happened was that just a thruster on the Gemini capsule got stuck, and it just got stuck, and that caused the whole problem. It actually really didn't have anything to do with the Agena docking. It was just a stuck thruster. It would have happened even had they not docked. And in trying to control the spin and get out of it, they had to use auxiliary power, and that meant they had to come down immediately. So they ended up landing wildly off course, far, far more than Scott Carpenter, and they had to be scrambled, and many days earlier, and they had to kind of scramble. That is a great example of disaster recovery. We're going to talk about disaster recovery a lot in this session. That's a real good example of it. So here's your cheat sheets. So remember I told you we were going to revisit our buddy Gus. So our buddy Gus is the guy on the left. He's got a couple new friends. And unfortunately, this doesn't end well. As you can see from the picture, that's not the way a spacecraft is supposed to look. So there was a test, and it was just a test. It's called the plugs out test. They're not going to go anywhere. It's just a test. Unfortunately, there were problems with the Apollo 1 capsule. There were things that they were moving too fast. They were bound and determined to get it launched before the elections in 1967. People were making bad choices because they had this incredible sense of urgency to meet the deadline, not only before the decade is out, but before the elections, before this. They were going too fast. They were pushing too hard. They made mistakes. And they didn't listen when the people on the front lines, such as our friend Gus, were saying there was a problem. During some of the training, Gus, who was, pretty mild-mannered person, actually hung a lemon on this capsule because there were just so many problems that weren't being resolved. And unfortunately, on January 27th, all of those 1967, all of those problems came to a very bad end. Unfortunately, what had happened was there were some problems in the wiring due to those problems I just talked about. And people were testing in 100% oxygen environment, which is the way the capsule was pressurized in space. However, in Earth, 100% oxygen is going to have a much different consistency than when you're in space with 0G. So the pressure builds up differently, the ratio builds up differently. And as we all know, oxygen is flammable. Importantly, obviously, when they are in space, they need to use Velcro because things tend to fly around. At the time, the Velcro that was being used was also flammable. So when you have highly flammable and way too much oxygen in an environment, along with flammable materials, in this case, the Velcro that was all over the place, along with bad wiring, a spark was ignited, and it was a very, very horrible fire. The seams of the aircraft actually burst from the heat, and it was probably the worst 20 seconds of a way to die in those 3 men's lives. Now, Gus kept going, even when he knew that there were problems with this spacecraft, even though he knew they were pushing too hard. And it goes back to the fact that he had the taint on his career from the Liberty Bell. And he spent so much time proving it wasn't his fault, proving that he was good, never saying no to a challenge, that he let that override some of his common sense. Although importantly, this was still a test, it wasn't a launch, and nobody thought it would be dangerous. Now, as a quality assurance specialist, one of the things that I constantly have to tell people is just because you think that this is only a test, it does not mean it has zero impact or consequences for your system. It is one easy mistake could mean we think that we're in a test environment and we accidentally run a test that runs a delete and we find out that we were connected to a production library. Hope you've got a good backup at that point, right? And things like that. So things do happen though that can be very good, and that is from this, NASA learned, started making some smarter choices, and were able to actually recover and succeed. Now, they did not launch in 1967, obviously, but they did launch in 1968. So obviously, this is probably one of the most famous and definitely one of the most beautiful pictures in all of NASA history. So let's talk about exactly why we went to the moon when we did for Christmas 1968. So mentioned this was such a race with the Russians, right? It was all about world dominance and all this other stuff. So a little bit of World War II history. Don't know if you guys know. So in World War II, when the Americans wanted to make the Germans think that they knew the Germans knew we were going to attack and land in France, but we wanted them to think we were actually landing at the Pays de Calais and not Normandy. So what the Americans did, and the British, was they queued up what appeared to be an entire invasion force. And it looked, if you were a plane flying overhead, it looked like there was an entire force completely set to go across the channel and land in Pays de Calais. What they didn't know is the tanks were all made out of rubber. All of the tracks that were in all of those fields were made out of these big lawnmower looking things. And all of these like planes that were supposedly there were completely fake. None of it was real. Now, ironically, guess who got caught by that same trick quite a few years later, about 10 years, 15 years later? That would be us. So the Russians wanted to make us paranoid. They were trying to confuse us. And so they had some rockets that looked very much from a reconnaissance plane like they were lunar rockets. They were very large. Yeah, they were painted trees, but we fell for it and we got very, very nervous. Now, I said NASA learned from their mistakes. At this point in time, they're getting very, very focused on getting to the moon first. We've gotten completely blown out of the water every other time it's happened. They didn't want this to happen again, but we weren't ready. The lunar landing vehicle was not ready, was not safe, and was not going to be ready. So now these guys are getting a little bit smarter. And they start saying, okay, if we can't land on the moon, what can we do to get a win? What they decided to do was go to the moon without the lunar vehicle and orbit the moon with a manned spaceship for the first time in human history. This was wildly, wildly successful. They were able to use the free return trajectory. They were able to test and initialize all of the communication protocols. They were able to prove that the command module and the service module could work 250,000 miles from home, and all of these wonderful things. So it was by any measure, it was wildly successful. So let's talk about why that might be important. And this is actually something where I'm going to stay on this for a minute. You know, if you've studied history at all, 1968 wasn't a banner year in American history at all. And by going and succeeding at something, by having a win, they really did bring out some of the national malaise and doldrums that had happened. There is a telegram that has been preserved by the Smithsonian that was just a plain old farmer, you know, just a wife in the middle of Nebraska who said, "Thank you for saving 1968." And it was Christmas Day, and they did read from Genesis, which of course we would now say is very, you know, Western centric and not very inclusive. But they did it, and they did wish everyone a nice wish on the good earth. Kind of a cool thing. So that is a nice way for us to move into our next thing. So as I said, Lunar Landing Module, also known as the LEM, was not ready to fly in 1968. So let's, you know, when you think about we're going to have a moon rocket, right? What's a moon rocket going to look like? I don't think anybody in their wildest imaginations pictured this, right? It looks like a toaster with legs. It was, you know, it was called a spider on one of the missions because that's what it looked like. And the command module was called Gumdrop for Apollo 10 and the first test of it. So how on earth did people decide that this is what it should look like to go to the moon? So there's a company called Brennan Manufacturing. It was on the it was in New Jersey, and they spent years and years of their lives trying to figure this out. And it's a great story. They were a small company. They won the award, you know, the contract. Very cool story if you want to hear about it. But at every point they had to think outside the box, right? This is not what a moon rocket's supposed to look like. The thing I want you to pay the most attention to is if you see in the picture, there's two very small triangular windows. Obviously, the most important part of having the proper type of landing vehicle for the moon was weight. Weight was absolutely critical. And the windows, because it was, of course, a failure point of the craft, were a huge concern, very, very, very heavy. So everyone thought, hey, we have to have these big, big windows. Well, the engineers kept going, this isn't going to work. We're never going to get the numbers to work with these big, big windows. So these guys started thinking, wait a minute, right now we've got these couches, we've got all these controls, the guys are going to, you know, the astronauts are going to be sitting down, they're further away, we need a bigger window for them to be able to see out of it. But why are they sitting down? Do we need them to sit down? Remember, the highest amount of G pressure they're going to have on the moon is like 1/6 G. It's not the same stresses on the body as it would be on Earth. Do they need to sit? There was no reason other than the fact we were just used to astronauts and pilots sitting down and doing stuff. So they went to management. They said, hey, we think we have a solution. Management said, no, that's never going to work. And these guys did something really cool. They just sort of hung out together for a night, and they used a whole bunch of cardboard, and they made a mock-up of what they were talking about. And they actually proved via this cardboard mock-up, this would work. We could go with much smaller windows if they're standing, their face is close to it. That's going to give them the range of vision they need. We're going to save all of these pounds, and we'll be able to move forward. Sometimes, particularly in IT, although it's probably true in all careers, there will be times you're telling management or your team or the customer something, and they're looking at you like you're crazy and you're wrong. When that happens, start thinking about how you can say it differently. What's going to make your argument? People aren't saying no to be mean. They're saying no because they can't see your vision. How can you change how you are communicating your vision to get the point across? And this is a wonderful example. And of course, it's just so cool that that is what actually landed on the Earth, or on the moon. So here's all the information that you can use to Google it or learn a little bit more about it. It's absolutely fascinating. For those of us in the Midwest, which is awesome when I talk to you guys, obviously there is one of the landers that was not used, so it never went into space, is at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. You can actually see a real LEM if you go to Science and Industry in Chicago. It's you just stand there and you look at this thing, and if you ever wanted to believe anything was humanly possible, that is just a moment that will take your breath away. Hopefully most of you have already seen it, but it's awesome if you haven't. Now that I've talked about cool things, we're going to go back to doom and gloom. Actually, this is a happy story though. So we've talked about NASA learning from their mistakes. We've talked about NASA learning how to make better decisions. However, just because you're making good decisions does not mean nothing will ever go wrong again. So Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem, was what is known as a successful failure. Awesome story because no one died. So as most people know, if you've ever seen the movie, and if you haven't seen the movie, watch it. It's awesome. Tom Hanks alone is worth watching it for. So what happened with Apollo 13 was that very shortly into the trajectory, they actually just did some routine maintenance. Again, spark, oxygen, space, bad combinations, and there was an explosion. And it took out a huge portion of the service module, which controlled all of the hydrogen and oxygen, which supplied the power and water. Therefore, literally, the service module, that is the engine, and I know this, I'm not sure how well you can see this because it is a very dark photo, but the circle on the bottom, towards the bottom of the photo, is the engine. Huge thing. And unfortunately, obviously, all of the power was gone. So they thought outside of the box. They had the lunar landing module attached. And so they went into that spidery looking thing, and they used it as a lifeboat to get them back to home. The way they were able to recover from this showed us that they really changed NASA, the astronaut corps, people who were making choices and decisions, learned from Liberty Bell. They learned from Apollo 1, and they learned how to do things better, smarter, and more responsible. The entire team really came together. The entire world came together to pray for these guys, and it was obviously a great story. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what happened, and we're going to tie it back to my favorite subject of testing. So a lot of people know the whole story about Apollo 13, particularly since it is such a good movie, but nobody knows exactly what caused the explosion to take place in the first place. Interesting story. So years earlier, obviously things were mass produced, and the tanks and all the components and engines that were being used in all of these spacecraft, there were multiples of them. They were being tested. They were being integrated at different times and in different ways. And there were lots and lots and lots of tests. What happened was that at one point, the voltage for the DC power changed, and somebody forgot to make a modification. So when a test was done, the entire tank would be filled with oxygen and hydrogen. The test would be run, and then it would be drained. Great, fine, wonderful. Well, a valve stuck at one point, and they weren't able to drain. They weren't able to drain the oxygen. So the team, including Jim Lovell, multiple engineers talked about this and said, all right, what should we do? It's stuck, we can't empty it. And they said, yeah, here's a great idea. Let's just let it run, and it'll empty, and that'll be no problem. It was a very good solution. It was perfectly rational. Now, what they did not notice or realize was that the voltage on the power had changed. It was now connected to a much higher voltage, and that higher voltage running for a sustained period of time led to a spark. That spark actually caused a fire within the tank that no one knew about, and that fire burned off all the insulation on all the wire that was in there. Nobody knew about it. This was obviously a solid state tank. And it was so reliable and so strong that they were able to have this fire that we knew about for years. But the problem was that the Teflon coating had burned off. And therefore, when it went to be switched on in flight, there was a spark. Spark ignited and blew it up. So again, when we talk about testing, when we talk about how we set things up, when we talk about things that we think, sometimes we need to realize that there are minute things that can go wrong. When I talk about testing and I say exhaustive testing is impossible, this is one of the examples, right? Everyone made best faith efforts. Everyone made intelligence decisions. There was just a minute flaw that wasn't caught. It was a defect, it became a bug, and that became, of course, a very epic failure. So let's start going back to things that went well. So after we landed and everyone was all happy, and after we got the Apollo 13 people back, everyone was all happy. We sent Shepard back up on 14. He got to play golf. Now it's time to get serious about science, right? So we're sending people whose main credentials is being fighter pilots, Top Gun, to do geology. Obviously, this was not their natural fit. And at the very beginning, there was quite a problem because, the astronauts hated anything to do with the geology lessons that were badly needed, right? If we're going to spend this much time on the moon, we really need to actually study the moon as a geologist. They were not geologists by trade, wasn't a happy fit. So a couple things happened in later astronaut groups. There actually was a new criteria called an astronaut scientist. And these gentlemen, again, they were all still men, did not need to be fighter pilots for the first time in NASA history. It was really not a needed criteria anymore. And they started looking for geologists. One of them was a guy named Jack Schmidt, who was a PhD from Caltech and was a geologist by trade. So he starts getting involved with the astronaut team. He is an astronaut, and he is sitting in on these classes, and he's like, this is the worst class ever. And I am somebody who has spent most of my life studying this stuff, and this is bad. So what he did was he said, we need a better teacher. And he reached out to somebody who had inspired and mentored him. And he got this guy, Lee Silver, to teach the astronauts. And one of the reasons that Lee was able to be so successful was he got it out of the theoretical, out of the dry. He got them into the fields of, canyons in Arizona and Nevada. He got them out into the real world, and he taught them how to do things. Now, obviously, Jack and Lee were not going to be able to teach, 5 or 6 astronauts how to have a PhD in geology. That's not realistic. What they were able to do was teach them how to be efficient at what they needed to do and distill it into here's 10% to pay attention to. Here's what you want to do. We have to do that so often. If I need buy-in from a user, I'm not going to teach them how to code, but I am going to walk them through the program so that they can identify any flaws that we have in our expectations or in the requirements. If I need to talk to management, again, I'm not going to, have them be an admin on a power system. That wouldn't work, but I'm going to talk to my manager about why numbers work, or what is the uptime, or what is the security concern that we need to have. So throughout your career, you are always going to need to be an advocate for IT. You're really going to need to be an advocate for the IBMI. So figure out in your own head how you're going to overcome reluctance, how to be a better teacher, or how to get a better teacher. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to somebody and I don't know how to explain it, but I'll say, go to Common, go to a user group, listen to one of Scott Clement's speeches, go listen to Charlie Guarino, go talk to Pete Masiella, go listen to them talk. I can't explain it right. Go listen to their session and become an advocate. When you see, hey, this is not working, they're not grasping the concept, figure out how to be an advocate for what they want to learn. So I've had some boring jobs. I am positive I've had the most boring jobs on the planet. No, actually, I really haven't. But this actually wins for detail-oriented, awesome, but boring. So obviously, the way we were able to get spaceships back into Earth where it's very, very hot coming through the reentry, was something called an ablative heat shield. So the heat would come into the shield and would burn off, dispersing it. Obviously, super important, needs to be absolutely perfect. This is how it was done. It's a very specific ablative heat shield material, but this is awesome. So that whole circle, which was 8 feet in diameter, was made out of honeycombs, and they were filled by hand, actually all by women. They were filled by hand, and then they were x-rayed. And if there was as much as a single bubble, they used dental drilling tools and emptied out that honeycomb and refilled it. Very cool. However, if that was not perfect every single time, obviously it would have been an epic failure. So, you know, there's all of these things that we don't always realize that are tremendously important. And it's very important. As we become parts of teams, identify the people who are filling something by hand and x-raying it and using a dental tool if they get it wrong. There's a great story about Roger Chaffee, who unfortunately perished in the Apollo 1 fire, who was on this big deal tour, and he was going to make, he was on Apollo 1, and he's big deal, right? He's the bomb. And he was touring a factory, and as he was touring, he was looking around everywhere, and he found a group of guys in the corner who were kind of watching. Obviously the astronauts were there and it was cool, but they weren't really part of the whole welcome reception. They were off in the corner. So he walked over to them on a break and asked them what they did. They were the guys who made the tools that fixed the tools that made the ship. He identified them, spent 15-20 minutes talking to them, paid attention to what was going around with them, and made them feel like they were $1 million. Obviously, there was no way this would have worked if those people weren't working as hard as everyone else involved. And it was Chaffee's ability to find them and make them feel special that was what made things such a success. So when you have a chance to become leaders in your community and in your organizations, remember to look around for the people who make the tools that make the tools. So, trajectory of progress. Mercury got more attention than anything else. While it was groundbreaking and absolutely fabulous, it was nothing compared to Gemini and Apollo. And Skylab, which no one even knows what I'm talking about when I say that, actually did more science than Apollo. So remember that, and I will say this a million times, 9 times out of 10 when we're dealing with user experience, or we're dealing with things that are going to get the attention in our organizations professionally, it's going to be the stuff that's really 10% of what the IVMI does. But it is the first thing that people notice. It's the flashy, it's the screens, it's whatever. And all of that work is going on the eye, that behind the scenes. So watch for the trajectory of progress. Make sure that you are committed to the Skylab amount of work, even though it's easier to be, the Russians who get up quick and easy, right? What's gonna come next? So obviously, you can see from my cup, I'm a huge fan of the Mars stuff and ingenuity and perseverance and all that great stuff. Voyager going to the outer ends of literally the outer ends of the solar system and reporting back to us. Like, we know we can send stuff out there, but we're getting it to talk to us while it goes out there. How amazingly awesome is that? And obviously the new Webb telescope, this stuff is awesome. And it just goes to show us that we are continuing to innovate as humankind. We are continuing to look into what we're doing. Great science, great math, really good books and articles. And if you do any search on any of these, and this is just a snapshot of 3 very interesting projects going on right now, there is a very substantial number of women and people of color involved. I love the fact that if I'm trying to talk to young students or teenagers or grammar school or junior high people, I can pull up any one of these projects, my kids happen to go to a very, very culturally diverse school. I'm lucky. And I think at one point they had like a 50-person class that had 35 different nationalities or something like that was the statistic. And when I went to talk to them for junior achievements, I was so proud that I was able to pull up the Marge Rover project and find somebody of descent of every single one of those 35 cultures. And I was able to have as many women that I was pulling up as examples as men. So I was able to go into a 6th grade class and find somebody who looked like every one of those kids. And I had 50 examples. That tells you we are moving forward from, 7 men who were all white male cookie cutter to a very diverse, responsive environment. And last but not least, 400,000 people. 400,000 people made this happen. So never ever forget that being part of something means that you are working with everyone else on your team. So actually my title has changed. I am now a senior project manager because I am with Service Express and everything is different. But all of my contact information is the same. So if you any questions, and how can I help?
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I am just so blown away every time with all the stories of the individual like successes and failures and the diverse amount of people and everything. It's just so cool that we're involved with something like that,
Yeah, this is super fun. And I try to find something new to say each time. I've now given this session I think 23 times, and each time I try to find a new story to highlight. And so far I've always been able to do it. So let's see what runs out first. Really cool stories to tell about individuals. But there's 400,000 of them, so I'm pretty sure I can keep going.
Wow, 400,000 people.
400,000 people were involved in Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo from start to finish. 400,000.
Wow. Unbelievable. Thank you very much for this beautiful information. I mean, wow.
I'm just so happy to be able to share it. It's obviously one of my favorite topics. Any questions or anything?
This is kind of just a general question, but for those of us that are, approaching graduation in the next semester and things like that, is there any, major piece of advice that you would give us when we're like looking for work or like entering the workforce, just things that you wish you knew when you were getting started?
Thank you for asking me that. Actually, I do have some advice. Number one, LinkedIn is your best friend. And I know it's old school, but old people like me like it. Put yourself out on LinkedIn. And kids say to me all the time, and I'm sorry, I'm almost 50. I call everyone a kid. Kids say to me all the time, but I don't have any work history. And I say, I don't care. Here's what I want to know. Tell me your school history. Highlight classes you've taken. When I'm looking at entry level people, if I see here's my major, here's some of the cool, projects I've done as a student, here's a paper I wrote and what it was on, that tells me you care enough to put information appropriately on a tool I can use to look up who you are. It tells me you care about me seeing what you've accomplished. And I take that paper you may have written as an undergrad as seriously as I would take somebody who says, oh, I did this huge big deal project with all these words in it. That is important. Because what I care about is you wanting me to be able to look you up on LinkedIn and see something about you. So number one, work on your LinkedIn profiles, make sure that they are strong and that you include things. I am happy to help you. I know Alan Pearson is happy to help you. I'm sure everyone on this call is happy. And I love mentoring. So if anyone wants to reach out to me and say, hey, can you look at this? Maybe it's right. Hit me up. More than happy to spend time with you. Second part, so that's part one. Part two is make friends in this community. reach out to me and make me part of your network. There's other people I can recommend as I get to know you better. Let's stay in touch, because there is a lot of entry level work out there, but it's by knowing people that we can say, hey, I was speaking at the student group. I got to know this person. They asked, they were telling me about something they were doing for a project. Hey, one of my friends might be talking about, we're hiring for this. Here's somebody I would recommend. So the more people that you can kind of connect with, the more people who are going to be able to say, hey, I just talked to somebody about that. Let me connect you on LinkedIn. But the default for now is always going to be, in a professional setting, let me connect you on LinkedIn. It's just the professional standard right now. So those are my 2 pieces.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And, it blows my mind every time I meet someone from the community, how open to, helping us everybody is, and how approachable everybody is. You, as a student, you think like, it's a little intimidating to reach out and things like that. But, I love, getting to meet everybody, because everybody's just so friendly that I've come across so far, and open,
I've got 25 years that I will tell you, this is really what this is. I'll tell you a story about very fast, because I know we're running out of time. I had breast cancer a few years ago, and I ended up going to Common because I was on the board of directors, and I felt it was very important that I be there. Well, I was on chemo and radiation, so I was bald. So it wasn't the best year of my life. And at one point, my mom was with me in the oncologist's office, and we were talking about whether or not I should go to California for this conference. I was talking to my doctor, I was talking to my mom. And my mom goes, no, it'll be okay. She's going to be with family. And that is what this IBMI community is. Like, it was to the point where my family, where my real family, my mom and my husband, were saying, she's going to be with family. And I did have a little bit of a flip. And you know what? I had 50 people taking care of me. So it's one of those things where it is a very unique community, very committed to peer-to-peer education, very, very committed to professional development, but we're also very, very passionate. So you're going to make friends, and we want people to succeed. So if we have an opportunity to support students as a community, we will rally around students as much as we humanly can.
Well, that's awesome. And, also I'm happy to hear that that everything turned out well with that. So that's awesome. I'm glad. But yeah, I totally believe it. That's what it's felt like, even, so far. So I'm excited for the future and stuff.
And we're happy to get to know all of you. So please come into our little happy Coven family. We're a little bit of a clique. That's okay. I always joke, it's kind of like the dark side. It's okay. Come over.
And I believe all of you are also going to WMCPA Spring Conference, and will work the conference.
And
Yes,
I will
definitely
be there.
going to volunteer for that.
I plan on
I'll be
going
there.
to. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to volunteer or not, but I'm gonna try.
Well, volunteering is a really good opportunity. Like, one of the things you do is you introduce guests like her, and it helps you get some of that public speaking nervousness out in a safe environment.
Even if you can't volunteer, because I know that with school and work, sometimes it is just not possible. The other thing I would say, though, I will be there. I don't know. You used to be able to say, I'll be wearing the bright red shirt. You're not going to be able to miss me. I won't be. I'll be there with Express Scripts. I don't know what color we're going to be wearing. It's blue. I have to obviously redo all of my red stuff. That said, find me. There's not a ton of women. I've got blonde hair. You'll be able to find me. And make sure during the expo that you're reaching out to people that make sure that you're talking to the teachers that and people will start making sure that you can meet speakers that can help you. Charlie Guarino will be there. He is quite possibly one of the nicest, friendliest, most supportive people in all of IT. And he will talk to you guys all night. If you are interested in programming, make sure you meet him. Scott Clement will be there. Again, the guy will talk. The guy loves this stuff. He will talk to you, you know, IBM champions, this, that, and the next thing. Pete and Larry will both be there. And if it happens on the IBM administration and they don't know about it, it does not exist. Richie Palma is another IBMI champion who will be there. I think Steve Pitcher will be there, who's an expert on security. So, you know, make sure that you're letting the contacts that you have, me, your teachers, whomever, know what you're interested in, so we can make sure that we can facilitate those introductions, because we're all looking forward to doing it.
Cool.
Yeah, very awesome. Yeah, great advice. I'm really excited to go. I wasn't able to go to the conference last year, but I'm really looking forward to this one that's coming up.
It'll be fun. And get to the craps table on the casino night early, because that is just awesome.
Yeah, Josh learned that last year.
yes, he did.
Yeah,
I
the
seem
guy
to
took
recall
all my
students winning.
chips.
Yep. So yeah, you'll have a great time. And you know, the fun thing is that as you start to do this, you know, we're going to be able to say, this was a student I met this year, and this is a student I met in 2020, and this is a student I met in 2016. And you're going to see, and so people who were like students when I first met them are now in hiring positions or are now here. And I'm able to go, hey, you two had your first favorite session was the exact same session, and let me introduce you to each other 5 years apart. All right, anything else I can do to help?
Again, I would like to extend my thank you to you and introducing the IBM community to them and making them comfortable about, you know, I mean, like sometimes being students, they are really, you know, not there, but yeah.
That's totally understandable. And if I do nothing else for you, you've gotten to know me a little bit, come find me and let me be your introduction, because I know everyone. And so I cannot tell you how often students have come up to me and been like, okay, so I sat in Charlie's, but I don't, you know, let me introduce you to Charlie. Let me introduce you to Pete. These are guys I've been friends with for 100 years. Let me help you. So you've gotten to know me. Let me help you get to know other people.
And will you also be part of Women in IT?
I am actually not sure about that, because with all of the chaos with iTech being sold, I think I will be. I just have to double check with Michelle and with Sue.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but I'll definitely be there on Tuesday night. So even if I'm not part of the conference, I'm not sure with the way work's going to go if I'll be able to be at the actual Women in IT part, but if I'll get there in the afternoon. So if I can help with anything, I will be there.
But seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us and just talk with us. It's been really awesome again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Please feel free to reach out, everyone. I'm looking forward to getting to know you.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Yeah,
Awesome.
bye.
Have happy holidays.
Everyone, bye.
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 Take care. Bye.